Okay, so this painting shows what the conditions were like in the Bethlehem Hospital in 18th century London. It's probably one of the earliest depictions of someone showing self-injurious behavior. In the foreground there, you can see a man punching his head with his fist. This photo, published in the Sunday Times newspaper in England only 15 years ago, shows a man living in a Greek institution whose wrists have been tied to prevent him from punching his head. So self-injury is clearly an extremely distressing and puzzling behavior disorder that we often see in clinical practice. I'm going to show a video clip of a 22-year-old man with IDD who would often punch his head with his fist when he's asked to do a task. In the clip, he's being asked to pick up his fork. As a consequence of his self-injury, I moved on. Self-injury can take many different forms. These are some photos of children who engage in head-banging, eye-poking, hand-biting, and tongue-chewing behaviors that have resulted in tissue damage. So self-injury is clearly a paradox. Why would someone deliberately hurt themselves and cause themselves tissue damage? Well, it turns out that people who have genetic syndromes associated with IDD are at increased risk for showing self-injury. Given that the prevalence in the IDD general population is around 20%, this suggests that there may be a genetic or biological component to self-injury. One important thing to guard against, however, is genetic or biological determinism. You can see here it says propensity to discuss weather. The cartoon is entitled The Human Genetic Code Deciphered. Being English, obviously, I feel that the propensity to discuss weather may be environmental. And in fact, I'm sure you know there's always an interaction between genes and environment. The psychologist Donald Hebb famously said, asking what contributes more to a behavior, genes or environment, is like asking what contributes more to the area of a rectangle, its length or its width. So Thorndike's famous puzzle box experiments, conducted over a century ago, shows us how complex behaviors can be learned relatively quickly over time by the environments in which we're placed. Because the cat here receives reinforcement for its actions, it learns how to escape from the box more quickly over time. The same principles of reinforcement and punishment apply to a complex behavior like self-injury. Over time, behaviors are continuously being reinforced by their consequences. In general, if a behavior results in a person obtaining something good or avoiding something bad, then that behavior will be reinforced. So, when we think about someone with IDD who shows self-injury or any other behavior, we often think the same thing as the man on the right of the cartoon. What's it all about? But it's important to remember that the behavior we see today has a long and extended history, in this case, reinforcement history. The reinforcement shapes and molds the person's behavior into what we see today. So going back to the clip, the man's self-injury began when he was just 2 years old. So given that his self-injury usually resulted in him receiving reinforcement, it's not surprising the behavior became so problematic. Once we know the purpose or function, however, it's not so puzzling. And once you know the function of the behavior itself, it's much easier to treat. The behavior analyst in the clip simply rearranged the environment so that the self-injury no longer resulted in reinforcement. Instead, he reinforced compliant behaviors. It was a very remarkably successful treatment. And it seems that self-injury in Fragile X syndrome is also influenced by environmental learning factors. In the photo here, we see a boy with Fragile X meeting someone new for the first time. It's very difficult for people with a syndrome. He's biting his hand because in the past, hand biting sometimes terminated social interactions. So we're currently running a study funded by the NIH to identify other environmental factors that may cause self-injury in Fragile X. Using a methodology called functional analysis, we systematically manipulate environmental factors to see what effect that they have on the person's behavior, and we can then identify the person's learning history. With my colleagues in the UK, we've also been examining the impact that environmental factors can have on self-injury showed by children with the Lang syndrome. To date, we found that the behavior starts at a very early age, and many children use the behavior to obtain attention from others. An interesting example of self-injury that doesn't appear to be motivated by social factors is skin-picking behavior in Prader-Willi syndrome. Over 80% of children with Prader-Willi syndrome engage in skin-picking, and this distressing behavior is perhaps equal to the more well-known problem of hyperphagia in the syndrome. To date, we found that skin-picking in Prader-Willi occurs primarily on the arms, legs, and extremities of the body, often on a daily basis, and appears to serve a self-stimulatory function. There doesn't appear to be any difference between the two genetic subtypes in terms of frequency, severity, or function. To determine what kind of stimulation individuals with Prader-Willi experience when they engage in skin picking, we're using functional magnetic resonance imaging techniques to see whether pain or reward systems in the brain are activated during bouts of skin picking. So far, we've seen about 12 participants, and what we do is we place them in the scanner. It's a short clip of what the picking looks like in the scanner. A camera is placed in the bore of the scanner, and we subsequently code when bouts of skin picking occur and don't occur on the video, and then line those up with the functional scans to see what regions of the brain are activated when the picking occurs. So to summarize, the take-home message really is that there's a very fluid link between genes, brain, and the nurturing environment. And we mustn't forget, when we think about complex behaviors like self-injury or other behaviors in IDD, that nurture plays a very prominent role. Thanks very much.